Hi, I'm Marilyn Kirschner, Editor-in-Chief of The Look Online, and I'd like to welcome you to the 6th of our Masters of Fashion interviews. Today, I have the great privilege of speaking with Bill Cunningham, the legendary photographer from the New York Times. Welcome, Bill, and thanks for being here.
Well, I'm delighted to be with you, Marilyn. I'm delighted. You're one of the favorite subjects when I see you on the street, so this is very pleasant to see what you do.
Thank you. Now, Jan Reeder described you as, who's the couture specialist of Doyle Gallery, described you as, quote, a fashion historian, scholar, trend spotter, cultural chronicler with a camera, fashion's consummate documentarian with a camera, who holds a unique position in the world of post-war fashion. I know that you don't like labels, but what did you think of the description? Did she leave anything out?
Oh, well, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you can leave it all out. But Jan Reeder, the woman who runs the couture sales at Doyle, is a woman with informed background, out of FIT, and the sales that she's conducting up there in the last 5 years, the presentation of the clothes, which date usually from the late 19th century, or sometimes the early 19th century, up through the present. And they specialize in really couture clothes of the 20th century and everything. But this woman brings with her an informed opinion. And when you go in there at the pre-sale and you look at those galleries, all I could think is, my God, Saks and Bergdorf missed the boat completely. That should be a floor in Saks or Bergdorf's. That's what people want to buy, or that are spending that kind of money and have that interest in fashion. I mean, it's tremendous. And Jan is the reason why Doyle's and Jan are the top, is because not only her background and her interest and the scholarly approach to everything they present. I mean, it's all there beautifully documented. It's really equivalent to many museum exhibitions, to go there and see what they have for sale. It's just, you just want to buy everything and then give it to the proper institution so it's kept for the future, you know. But no, I admire enormously, because up to this point at the auction houses, you had people that meant well and were enthusiasts, but they didn't have an informed background. Jan has an informed background, and there's a big difference.
And let me say, because I was at the auction, the clothing there was not only fabulous, but for some reason people walked away with some really great steals this time. And
well, the prices, if you know what they are, it goes up and down depending on the traffic and the dealers that are buying it. I understand, but everything is in pristine condition. It doesn't look like a thrift shop.
no.
You see, Jan, the gallery, they simply don't take anything in like that. And they had a ball gown worn by, let's see if I can remember, the sale last spring, worn by George Washington's niece.
Oh, Worth.
Yes.
Worth.
Ball gown.
Yes.
I mean,
that went for $125,000, I believe. That was a record setter, yeah.
This was a treasure. I mean, and the preservation of it, and of course, there was no lead weight in the fabric that Worth used, so they haven't rotted or slit like so many of them do. But that was a prize. I hope a museum got it. I don't know who did. And the recent sale, God, there were so many things. I wouldn't know what to say. But that is the place. If you're going to buy and invest, and last Friday night, it was a 2-night event in Philadelphia with the opening of the Kimmel Art Center under a great atrium, and there's the Philharmonic Hall, 2 buildings within the atrium. It's like you put a glass dome over Lincoln Center. But at any rate, it was a really gala opening. The first one Friday night, and then Saturday night, the not Philharmonic, the Philadelphia Orchestra, excuse me. But anyway, on Friday night, Mr. Kimmel's wife, and he was the largest donor to the project, I looked and I thought, for heaven's sakes, and I didn't ask her if she bought it at Doyle's, but she was wearing about 1966 Mark Bowen couture dress when he was at Dior.
Which you recognized immediately?
Yeah, because, designers, you don't have to see the label. Their clothes, like great artists, you just know by the artist, the technique of paint and their style. The same with designers. You don't have to look at the label. I mean, you can just tell. It's as simple as that, on that level. But there was a woman of obviously enormous affluence on a very important occasion, and she turned to a dress from the past. And then on Saturday night, which was full regalia, and what I call heavy artillery jewelry, Mrs. Kimmel, like many of the women, I didn't notice any jewelry because it's not really something I'm interested in, but I don't remember her, outside of earrings, wearing anything like that. But there she had on the most beautiful kind of mermaid black velvet evening gown, high collar, and one shoulder that was partially appliqued lace insets. It was just really tremendous.
Whose dress was that?
And it was Gautier, recent couture. So you see the fluctuations. And that's why I feel the Doyle sales that Bergdorf and Saks, to keep their prestigious point of view, it's a shame they didn't pursue this 10 years ago. And of course, it's in the right place now, because God knows what they would have done. But it reminds me always in, when was it? About 1951 or 2, Dorothy Shaver, who was the president of Lord & Taylor's at that time, she opened a department in 1 August for preschool, college young women, and it was stocked with 1920 raccoon coats. Because it was the fad. And she realized that. But she knew, that's the trouble with the business people and the bankers running fashion. They don't have the sensitivity of knowing what really is going to happen. It's what the bottom line, what the computer tells them. Fashion is not that way. It's very personal. It's the most personal thing you do. You get up in the morning and you get dressed. That reflects, no matter what you have on, good or bad, it reflects your feeling of yourself. There's no two ways about it. It's the first important act we do when we wake up. And of course, I look like hell, all clothes. But I'm just a worker in the factory, so it doesn't help. But I mean, I'm crazy to see it on people like yourself. I always think, my God, how do you do it? I mean, the thought that goes into it. Now I realize we're 50 years into the women's liberation, whatever you want to call it, and they can't seem frivolous in the workforce, but it would be a crime to lose this important art of dressing the body.
Well, it's one reason why I'm happy I never had to work in like a law office. I'd have a lot
wrong with it, because it's enormously successful women, and why not women be just as successful as men? I mean, that's why this past election, whether I liked the senator, or a woman running for senator, I voted for Hillary Clinton. I figured, hey, we've had the guys in there long enough. I mean, what could she do that's so wrong? And then I voted for George Bush for another reason. And everyone said, you must be nuts. I said, no, not at all. But it's the same way in fashion. You just have to go along with the current. It's the ocean coming in, and you can't fight it. And women's equality, women are equal to men. Of course, they're just as brainy. Don't be ridiculous. I mean, there are physical features, naturally one thing or the other. But the age of decorating women as objects of men's success, oh, forget it. I mean, that's ancient history. It doesn't exist. And sure, at special occasions, women or men like to dress up. Look at men of course, they're very timid because they want to be perceived as serious, but you'll see an interesting vest, a waistcoat, an evening, or recently a little flag bow tie and a matching cummerbund. Well, for most men, that's really very daring. And even though women are important positions and more and so, and look at right now in Mr. Bush's government.
Condoleezza Rice?
Yes.
Amazing.
Well, no, it should be. Their minds
but
are the
she's-
same as men. As a matter of fact, probably more rational. They don't take crazy risks, And so everything, it's a marvelous time to have been alive and see all this come about.
Let me ask you a question. How did your original love of fashion begin? Do you remember what sort of moved you to sort of develop your career in this business?
Gee, I don't. I can't. I just know I always had an enormous interest, and I guess in a funny way, early on, all through the 30s, I was always saving money, whatever allowance I had, newspaper route or whatever little job I had on the side, and I remember many times buying dresses for my mother because I didn't like the way she dressed. But I had no idea. We didn't have fashion magazines in our home because that was not the family's interest. They weren't interested in that. They were more interested in dressing the inside of the mind. But so maybe that I just thought it was a lovely art form to see beautifully dressed people, and I still do. That interests me very much. If I'm depressed, the best thing is to grab the camera and go out on the streets hunting for wonderfully dressed people and photographing them, documenting them.
How do you feel that the street scene has changed because of globalization?
Well, they've changed because the separation between how people dressed in England and how people dressed in Paris are not the great differences they were, but by no means are they all the same. Each one still has its built-in educated characteristics. And although the Gap and the Banana Republic and Ralph Lauren are in Paris, and they have shops in Bond Street and so forth, it's how people put it together. It's not what you buy, it's what you do with it.
See, I think that you've had a lot to do with the democratization of fashion, if you will, because you have an elitist's eye and you have the taste, but you're not a snob. You find the beauty in the common, and you photograph through class lines, age lines, ethnicities.
Well, I'm just interested in people that look great. And that doesn't, my God, it can be the cleaning lady. That has nothing to do with it. If you look great, and you have style, and you're born with it, or you develop it in different ways. Oh no, it's marvelous. I mean, that's what makes it special. Lots of people have money, and they can go to the best dressmakers, tailors, and buy everything in sight. They're still never going to have style, because it has to do. You have to begin, number one, with posture, manners, carriage, gestures, all of these things, and how you wear clothes. And then the final result, how you put them together. And the appropriateness of occasion, which was lost in the 1960s, totally went down the drain, it still exists, although people don't want to admit it. It still exists. It existed in Philadelphia last weekend, and this was an enormous occasion for the Philadelphians. It was the first home especially built for the Philadelphia Orchestra. See, they had always been in the Academy of Music, which was built as an opera house in 1857, I think. Now they had their own home. An exquisite, beautiful concert hall. You can't imagine it's so beautiful. The horseshoe almost is Baroque in its shaping of the boxes, and the plainness of it is, and for that opening, wow, as I told you earlier, people dressed to the occasion appropriately. On Friday night, it was a mixed, opening. It was the first gala, and it was a mixed and so forth, and a big concert by Elton John that went on for an hour. And people dressed differently for that, and wonderfully. Women in great pantsuits, but evening pantsuits, and maybe with a lovely brooch or something. And then on Saturday, they blossomed in beautiful evening clothes. And then on Monday, they put their work clothes on, suits, and went back to law firms, banks, whatever they were doing. Yeah. See, you just don't have women that go to lunch and spend the afternoon or the morning worrying what they're going to wear that night, and the maid pressing it and putting it all out. That doesn't happen. That's what's gone.
Right.
And it's marvelous to go out in the evening and during the day and find answers to these problems of what's working for women and what isn't working. And that's the interesting part of it.
What designers do you think address the needs of modern women the best?
Well, I would, first off, all of these designers couldn't be around or successful if they hadn't developed a style and of their own, a signature style, that is, and a following. See, they have to have that. And each one attracts its own clientele, its own following. And women who have any sensibility themselves go to the designer who suits their needs, their feelings, and how they want to project themselves. So to signal out one designer and say, that's not really a good idea. They all have something to say, some stronger than others. And granted, the hype in the magazines and the newspapers, that has more to do with celebrities. And you can't mix celebrity with clients. Because first off, stylists select and give the clothes, often from the designers, free of charge to the celebrities. This is something they spent their own money for. They'd look very different if they did. Right. So women, I have more interest in women that go out and spend their own money and dress themselves, and if they don't have that kind of innate taste, they go to a place like Bergdorf's or Bloomingdale's or wherever it is, or these small specialty shops all over the country, where they are advised by people they can trust, not salespeople who are just trying to make a sale, and build their book up for the day. So it's a certain trust. It's always been that way. That hasn't changed. A trust between the client, the designer, the client and the store, the client and the salesperson. That's always been that way. Nothing has changed. And the most successful operations, that's what the couture was all about, was the dialogue between the designer and the client. Without that, do you think they'd know what to do? No, you'd end up with that marvelous show at the Metropolitan Museum that opened 2 weeks ago of extreme exaggerations, that clothes that were never made for a client. There was never a dialogue. They were made, I guess, just to promote an image or something and go right into a museum. But that's not fashion. Fashion, to me, is when it's worn by women who pay for it themselves. That's the important thing. You take that away and you just have wild fantasies, uncorralled designs, and it's a hoot. Yes, it's been done through the centuries, but what they forget that in the 16th century, all of those things at the Metropolitan, those drawings, often spoofs by cartoonists. That had nothing to do. Yes, it was an extreme exaggeration of fashion by a cartoonist.
I was just curious how if there was too much emphasis on newness from one season to the next and trends. That Marc Jacobs, for example, actually made a quote. He said that fashion is arbitrary, and that for him, that necessarily means that he has to go purposely for the next season against what he did the past season. What do you think of that kind of thought?
Oh, I think that's baloney. That's not fashion. That's hype. That's for the magazines. That's for the editorials. They have to decorate the pages so that you stop and look and say, oh. But the modern woman, I believe, is turned off by that. They're turned off. That's the other side. It certainly wasn't meant of the Metropolitan Museum's exhibit. It is an absolutely astounding statement of why fashion died. Those exaggerations. Right. No, women just ignore it. They see all that and they just don't pay attention. They turn the flap, or they don't buy the magazines. But don't think the fashion world, per se, selling clothes has died. They have just ignored the designer wilder fantasies, and that's why covering the collections in Europe, particularly more than New York, are really unimportant now. That's why the buyers from Barney's and, what was it, Bergdorf and Saks didn't go last time.
Neiman's also.
Yes,
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
some of them said they didn't want to have their buyers and all in Europe in case there was another terrorist attack and they couldn't get them back. All that may be true, but it was unimportant because all the buying, or 80, 90% of the buying, was done in August at the pre-collections held in the showrooms. Those are the real clothes. Those are the clothes they never put on the runway.
Right.
They put on all these wild eccentricities that the magazines and newspapers, we all photographed. There are 300 or 400 photographers. That goes all over the world, and people look at it and say, oh, those crazy people. Well, it has nothing to do with it. Those fashion houses are all in business to make money. And so they have to make clothes that people want to wear. So those, we should all stop going to those collections, and we should go to the pre, and they're not even shows, and see what they're showing for women to really wear. That's the biggest change right now. And I think this post-September 11th, where there's going to be many changes, the attitudes, that kind of extreme is finished, washed up. And a great believer in that was Bernadine Morris, the fashion reporter at the Times. And I remember she'd always say, come on, Bill, it's, I don't know, it was the 1st of January or whatever. She said, we're going up to whatever house to see the pre-collections. Because this is what they spend 60% of their money on. Well, now I think it's 80 or 90%. And rightfully so. So anything, they go to Europe in case they'll see some ideas and maybe they'll... But a year ago, a year and a half ago, Saks brought back and put in its Fifth Avenue windows the John Galliano, well, they were costumes. They were cardboard boats and cars that he had the models in. I mean, it was something, it would have been perfect for R.H. Macy's to buy for the clowns in the beginning of the Thanksgiving Day parade. But that's all right. He was showing what he wanted. They had in the showroom the stuff that's wearable. But for Saks to put it in the window, and I remember standing there and overhearing the conversation of the passersby, and people looked and said, "What this costume?" It didn't draw anything. It just turned people away. So I think that there's a new president of Saks Fifth Avenue now, and I think she's a woman who understands women and where they're going and where they're at. And these kind of ridiculous nonsense are. Well, it's counterproductive. It doesn't help anyone, and it certainly isn't helping sales. So they're all crying now, well, listen, just put something in the stores people want to buy and at a price that's affordable. Mm-hmm. I think that's,
Let me ask you a question. As a photographer, do you prefer the small showroom to the large runway in terms of what you do?
Well, it doesn't matter to me. Because when I started, when I first went to the shows, I mean, you couldn't even mention the word camera, that it put you in jail, let alone bring one in. And it wasn't until, when was it? Well, in the 1960s, that allow you to come in and maybe take 4 or 5 pictures during a show. And then gradually, very gradually, it began. But it wasn't overnight. It was over a decade. And then the shows got bigger and bigger because people saw them as theater. But what happened was then the designers felt, oh, we've got to make something more exaggerated. And that's what they did, and that's why you end up with what's at the Metropolitan Museum. Those are wild exaggerations to keep the attention of an audience of 1,500, 1,000. One time Terry Mugler had at a sports arena, there were 5,000. Then Saint Laurent topped him and held it at, the soccer matches about 3 or 4 years ago in Paris, an audience of 60,000. Well, for Pete's sake, who could even see the models down there? They couldn't see the clothes. He just sent out 300 girls wearing clothes. It was all hype. So the game was over then. And now we'll start over. It's all finished. Now we're going to start with making real clothes. We all go back to the pre-collections, see those. Mm-hmm. And, I think it has to be in small presentations. And that's going to leave out a lot of people. But the big shows were drawing, they weren't buyers, they weren't press, they were just thrill seekers. They were going in looking for a thrill.
In one case, I think Andre Leontelli couldn't even get to a seat at Michael Kors. It was probably being filled with people that were on the outside who didn't even belong in there. So I mean, it's gotten a little bit out of hand, I think.
Well, I don't think. Well, Michael Kors was never exaggerated. He is one of the ones who never went over the top. There was always clothes that people could wear.
Oh no, I wasn't meaning.
And aside from that, he didn't draw the groupies, the mad groupies. See, that started in Paris at Terry Mugler and Claude Montana.
And actually, Gaultier and yes,
was the first. I mean, the fist fights were unbelievable because they were the first to uncorral this whole fashion as something to enhance a woman's body. They did away with that. It was just wild, exuberant imagination, and it was fun. There's no denying it's fun, but no one was buying it. No one could wear it. Unless the designer was there to pin it on you.
Mm-hmm. Do you still find that the Paris street scene is, or do you think that the Paris street scene is more interesting than New York, or not necessarily?
I think the French, you have to understand, in their education, it has a background of priority of dress and taste, which determines your class distinction. It's built in. Here in this country, it's a free-for-all. But no, I think New York, if you're going to solve the problems of the modern woman, you're going to do it right here in New York. Whether you like it or not, there's no question about it. It's going to be right here because the realities people are facing are here. But I would say the new women who are running French Vogue, Corinne Rothfeld, yes. Dazzling. In the understatement of fashion, but the proportions, the cut, the simplicity, the style, and to me, that magazine, and she's only been there, a year? Mm-hmm. But I've been photographing her around and seen it for years, 10 years or more. This woman, she has her finger on the raw nerve of fashion. There's no two ways about it. Just like Anna Wintour had it on the raw nerve of fashion from the late 80s and the 90s. Those people are marvelous. Those women know what time of day it is.
I was going to ask you about magazines, which ones you read, or which ones you think are doing a good job, and I guess you answered that.
Yeah, I think you have to look at them all. You can't draw an opinion until you've seen everything. You can't draw an opinion about designers until you've seen them all. That's the mistake people make. I don't think you should put pen to paper until you've seen every collection you can physically get into.
So you look at every magazine that comes out?
I can, yeah. I mean, as much as I get everything and try to look at it and see, and all in their special areas, and sometimes they lose the direction and it takes a while because the publishers are looking for other directions, and I think the greatest danger of magazines and newspapers at this time, particularly magazines, is that the advertising departments are taking over editorial content. I think it's very, very dangerous. And I mean, there was always such a separation of advertising and editorial, like church and state, blah, blah, less so in Europe. I mean, everyone in Europe that worked for a magazine worked for the designers. I mean, that was,
Oh, I know. When I was at Bazaar, you almost couldn't be caught talking to somebody in the other side because the advertising side.
So they didn't influence you. Yeah. But you see, it's the same thing happened with the photographers when you had the great artists sketching fashion. They were, in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. They were marvelous. And the last great one was Antonio. Mm-hmm. But when you had all of these people, Kenneth Bloch, Eric, Boucher, it went on right back to George Lepap and the crowd, then who started with Poiret in 1910. Well, when you then jump up to the it really started a little bit in the 40s, but in the 50s, the photographers replaced the illustrators, the artists, who gave the dream and the romance to fashion, the mystery. And what the photographers did was quite marvelous. Someone like Louise Dahl Wolfe, they were enormous people, and Avedon. But by the end of the 50s, the photographers were out of hand, and they were using the fashions as props for their pictures. Mm-hmm. And the sitting editors who were there to supposedly control this was losing ground and giving in to the photographers because they realized they were making sensational pictures. Mm-hmm. Well, they were, but it had nothing to do with fashion. Mm-hmm. So it started there, and now the photographic thing has gone, as far as it can on that kind of nonsense. And now you have the advertising people really dictating what's going on. It's one time it was the stores, but not now through their credits, and whether they'd advertise. And it's not that; it's now the advertising departments and everything. We just look what happened just a month ago with Giorgio Armani. He pulled everything out of American Vogue because he didn't feel they were giving all his ads because he didn't feel they were giving him the editorial he felt he should have. Right. So he wanted to own the magazines. And apparently the publishers of Condé Nast flew to Milan, from what I hear, and tried to smooth everything down. I mean, now this is serious business. Yeah. So the designers who now are extraordinarily rich, I mean, Armani is, the Duke of Milano. Well, I mean, forget it. They're just clothes to dress women. But if they think they own the world, the ones who own the world are the ones with talent. And it could be the talent of the women who dress themselves, or it could be designers. We're waiting for a great talent to come along.
Do you think there is one now?
Oh, there always is. There always is going to be one. Which one, I wouldn't know. That's playing games.
Let me ask you a question. At the New York Times, do you sense that fashion is not a high priority?
Well, the New York Times is a newspaper, international news. No, it's certainly anything that goes in the Times is a priority, that it is done as well as it can possibly be, the information to the reader, but certainly not the news, what's going on right now in Afghanistan, what's going on in Russia, what's going on in South America, all of these things. That's what the New York Times is about. If you want to read just fashion, I suppose I'll look at pictures, you go to women's wear.
So do they really care what goes inside the fashion pages pretty much?
The Times? Oh, yes. Oh, sure. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. You may not agree with them, but oh no, that's not done lightly. That's not, not at all.
Following 9/11, did you make the conscious decision to really focus on what was happening in New York as opposed to the fashion scene on your pages? I mean, in other words, did you have to really go against what they had wanted in terms of fashion coverage and say, no, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to show patriotism?
No, it didn't happen that way. On the morning of September 11th, I get to the office around 7:30 in the morning. They have the best oatmeal in town. And that's why I look so wrinkly, but that's beside the point. And of course, I saw all this on television. And I thought, oh boy, this paper is going to be in really a state with people, it's the serious part. Mm-hmm. I better go back to the studio and bring down a street fashion story so they have it in hand, because everything's going to have to be done days earlier to get, you knew that this is a problem. But then I went out on my bike around noontime. Oh no, it was around 11. I got back out and bicycled around the city, and I'm photographing documenting. And then I went on down to the village. I got as far down that day as Franklin Street, and you couldn't get any further. And then I went west, and I was just looking everywhere, just documenting. I had nothing in mind, just to document. And because you couldn't get below Franklin Street, I went to the West Side Highway. And there I saw the most marvelous sights. Kids out of Greenwich Village had torn up cardboard boxes and handwritten signs. And in one case, they had taken a door off a closet or something and written, "Our heroes," because the West Side Highway was closed except for all the emergency vehicles, the help, everything that was going down. And there were these kids cheering them on as they went by. And I thought, oh, my God, isn't that wonderful? I knew then, that's it. And I got to a phone, and I called the art department, and I said, look, forget the fashion page. I don't know if I've got a story. I'm going to have working on it. Well, we've already laid out the fashion page. And I said, you can't do that. I mean, what's going on is so serious. And when I got back, the editors had already told them, we're not going to use a fashion page. We're going to drop the party page. And we hadn't even started it because I was going to use the party from Monday night, which was Mark Jacobs after his show. And there was this extraordinary party out on the pier that Robert Isabel had transformed into a garden of grass, everything covered. I mean, it was really, in retrospect, it was frighteningly strange because from the angle I was photographing it on the north side of that pier, after we came out of the show in the tent, there were the Twin Towers, and everything lit up, and everyone just having great frivolity. And my God, the next morning it would all go down.
Right.
But so all of those things, but no, it was nothing is conscious. See, I go out on the street with no preconceived idea, and I let the street speak to me. You have to understand that. I might spend 3 weeks or a month doing a story. I don't go out and say, today it's pearls. I don't believe that. I let the street talk to me. I think it's more honest. I find it sometimes very difficult. Many of the stories, I have piles of stories like this that are never used. Sometimes I'll redo them, even once or twice, because I didn't finish. Then I'll redo it if I think it's still a fashion or a trend or something of interest a year later. And if I don't feel it's a trend, then I dump it. And I try to find what is honestly there. That's the point. You see, with the Times, you have to bring to the reader really something that's of interest. You have to put a certain definite integrity, honesty into it. Otherwise, the readers of the Times are not going to pause and look at it. It can't be fake. It can't be hype. That's not what the Times is about. You want that, then you read the glossy magazines and celebrities. The Times is not that way at all. That's why you don't see pictures of my things of celebrities. Very often I wouldn't even know who they were or care. What you see are, I hope, people putting their fashion together in an interesting way that gives the reader information. Whether I succeed, that's something else. I don't know.
Let me ask you a question. What about retiring? Do you ever think about it, or?
No, because you see, I don't look at this as work. This is something I've done all my life because I enjoy it. No one pays me enough to do something I don't enjoy. You know what I mean? It just isn't that way. As a kid, in a funny way, I got started on this when I was as a kid, and I used to work after school in a department store. But then I was crazy about the whole thing. And I was always observing people, and I would stand outside Bonwitz when they opened in Boston in '47. And the president of the store said, Bill, you stay out there at lunchtime, and you just look at the women, and in your eye, redress them the way you think they should be. And that probably is the earliest as conscious aspect of it. But I did it even before, but I wasn't aware of what I was doing.
I know that you were a hat designer. Did you ever want to be a clothing designer?
I had a hat shop, probably because I could afford to make hats. I couldn't make dresses. Didn't have the money. And hats, small amount of money to material. You create something, and it's rather like sculpture. It's wonderful. It's a marvelous way. Many people started that way. Chanel started as a hat maker, and Charlie James started as a hat maker, and most people move on. I developed that, and then, of course, the wearing of hats went out. They lost out to wigs in the late 50s. So that was that. And at that time, I guess the direction changed for me when John Fairchild, who was the publisher of Women's Wear, and he knew the women that I kind of grew up with here in New York. They owned a shop called Chez Ninon. It was a custom dressmaking shop from the...
Where Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis
Oh,
But
yes, Jackie used to come in. Uh, uh, but they dressed, we never thought Mrs. Onassis was that important because she wasn't a big client. They dressed everyone in New York and in America of really that wanted French clothes that we reproduced there. And I would go to Paris with the ladies, Nona and Sophie, Miss Nona Park and Sophie Schonen. And so I was brought up in that field. And at any rate, John Fairchild admired them. I don't know, I think he admired them. Or he may have felt that by getting me, he would get to know what Jackie was buying, because that was in the early 60s, 61 or 2. So he hired me to write a column. But I wasn't about to tell him what Mrs. Kennedy was buying at that time or anything of the sort. And at Cheney Known, we knew enough to be discreet. Mm-hmm. You didn't discuss things like that. It's none of anyone's business. And, so I'm not a very good press person because I'm not aggressive enough.
So that was the first time that you wrote?
Yes, yeah. And it was a little column. It only lasted 10 months, and then we got into bad feelings because I was reviewing things in an honest way, and I hadn't realized that you don't do that you have to kind of talk around it and do all that. So there were problems, so I just thought, that's not for me.
Okay, well, let me bring this up because you have mentioned that in the world of fashion journalism, the world is divided into two parts, the pickers and the writers. Do you care to mention who you've worked with that you would categorize as pickers versus writers?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's how it was done in the early years at the New York Times. Or rather, in the post-Virginia Pope. Virginia Pope was the great fashion editor of the Times. She was a woman of enormous education, and at that time, she was probably one of the first women editors. And she started the Fashion of the Times, not as a magazine, but as a live performance in a Broadway theater, where the public bought tickets. And she was the first important journalist, and she got the first interview with the Duke and Duchess of Windsor after their announcement of marriage. And so anyway, to make a long story, after Miss Pope left the Times, they had the writers, and then they had a system where they had the pickers. Those were people who were really into fashion, and they went to the collections with the writer. Or sometimes they went on their own, and they chose what was worthy of being written about, what was new and why it was new, and they would tell that to the writer, and the writer would put it in the Times style of writing, which is a very strict code of use of English language, and my God, I'm as far from it as you could get. I mean, send me back to the Soho News.
Who were the writers and pickers currently?
Right off bat, one of the really great ones was Patricia Peterson. Pat Peterson. This is a woman who, she just had it in her blood. And she would then relate the stories to Gloria Emerson, who would help her with them, because I think Patricia had the byline. See, it was very shadowy there. But Gloria Emerson was the writer. And then eventually they kind of did away with the pickers, and Gloria Emerson went and reviewed the collections. And this was the great writer who went on to Vietnam and all those, and wrote the book Winners and Losers. And I mean, this was the great one. But Patricia and all the women that worked with her in the magazine, and they were women that they really knew about fashion. It was Patricia Peterson and your names, to pull them out of my head right now, who first brought Perry Ellis to the editor. And I won't mention which editor, but the editor, well, why not? It was Carrie Donovan. And later, Carrie said, or it was posed in her obituary a month ago, that she discovered Perry Ellis. Well, in point of fact, Patricia Peterson brought the clothes in for Carrie to see, and Carrie said, "Oh, what are these? Take those out." Later, of course, when Perry Ellis.
Then she came to Bazaar, and I got them to her attention.
That was probably later than Patricia. Patricia was very early.
Yeah.
I remember you told me that story.
Yeah.
So it was, nothing is clear cut. Everything, no one is running the show themselves.
In the group today, Spindler, Trebay, Belafonte, which of those do you consider the pickers or the writers?
What time?
The current crop, Amy Spindler, Trebay, Ginny Belafonte.
Today the fashion editors pick their own clothes.
So they're writers and pickers. Oh, okay.
And write the stories, yeah. No, I'm speaking of in the late 40s and 50s. That's how it was done. No, now it's all, everything is speeded up, and it's not always a good idea. There was, for me, a very troubling aspect a couple of years ago. Well, it was in 1999, and one of the major writers, had put a list of the 10 most influential designers of the last century. So I'm reading it, and it started off fine. It was Poiret. Well, I've forgotten how the order went. When I got to the 1970s, well, as we got to the 50s, I thought, hey, wait a minute. And then I quickly read quick. And when we got to the end, I thought, what the hell's going on here? The writer had left out there was no way she could miss the two most important designers of the 20th century. Marilyn Kirschner, who invented the bias cut. Clothes had never been cut on the bias since earliest recorded history. And in the 1920s, Marilyn Kirschner, the great dressmaker, invented the bias cut. Changed everything. Was never the same after that. And we went on. I thought, wait, this is not possible. And then I went on, and I thought, hey, they didn't mention Balenciaga. And he was the greatest architect of fashion, of pure form of the 20th century. And then we ended up with other people who I would say were manufacturers. So that was a great disappointment to me. And no one knew the difference. No one ever wrote a letter about it or said anything. No one could care less. I don't think people care. What they care is what they've always cared about. What's the dress do for me? What is the length? And how much does it cost? That's the basics. I mean, it's really like that. I'm interested in all the rest, but no one else is, or very few people.
Bill, is there somebody that you can see doing what you do? In other words, is there anybody else that you think could do what you're doing?
Oh, it's not that. No, I think no one would be crazy enough. First off, people want to make money. See, I have no interest in money, not because I have any, but I just live in a small way. It isn't that. I just enjoy it. Who would stand out on the street for 3 weeks to find just the right-looking woman? You'd have to be some kind of a nut. A lot of people accuse me of that. But that's neither here nor there. That's my pleasure and what I enjoy. And I'm very grateful for the New York Times. It's the greatest showcase in the world. When people say, do a book, I think, are you nuts? Every Sunday, I have the greatest book in the world.
I was going to ask you about a book.
Come on.
I was going to ask you about a book, if you had ever been approached about a book.
Oh, yeah, all the time. People mean well, but fashion books are very limited, and frankly, I don't think we need any more pollution. We've got enough with that. But if you have something to say, and seriously and worthwhile, and you place it in the New York Times, believe me, my dear, there's nothing nowhere in the world like it. That is the honesty, everything about the paper, the product they put out every day. I mean, with all the problems and people who the complacency of some people and so forth, it's still, that is it, that paper, as far as I'm concerned.
So you seem like a very happy man. You get up in the morning and with a smile on your face, you do what you like to do. Even in the rain, you stand out with a smile on your face.
Oh, well, yeah, well, I don't know. I guess I just enjoy life, and I enjoy what I do. That's all there is to it. And I try not to have I don't have charge cards, so I'm not way over my head in debt, and I don't all those things that weigh people down. I suppose it's modern world, but I try to do away with all that.
Go.
When you look back on your career, is there anything that you remember as being totally fabulous or unforgettable or totally over the top?
Yes. In 1947, Dior's new look was marvelous. The romance that he returned to fashion was the feminine romance, was absolutely staggering. And it wasn't embraced immediately. There were many people, as you know, were totally against it. As a matter of fact, Time magazine put Sophie of Saks Fifth Avenue on the cover, and then they, for decades later, said, the only fashion designer on the cover of Time magazine. And I said, yes, but for the wrong reasons. She was put on because she was against the new look. She thought it would never happen. And of course, she was totally wrong. So what happened? And Adrian was the same thing. He wouldn't leave his broad shoulders or all of that stuff he had developed from Schiaparelli in the 30s. Adrian had developed for the films, and they were fabulous things, and that's what everyone's collecting. But he could not embrace Dior's new look. And I remember as a stock boy, I would carry his suits at Bonwitz back and forth, and then I can remember by 48, 49, they were all on the sale rack. We couldn't even give them away. If I had any brains, I would have brought them. But that's beside the point. And there's so many things like that. I think the greatest revolutions that I saw, or changes, were Dior and then Courrèges. Courrèges was like something you never saw before when it first came. And his shows, I think they were, when you were invited, 12 people in a little showroom on the Avenue Calbert. It was like a monastery. And when those I remember my feeling was that he invented the third sex. That's when women came out of the femininity of Dior and everyone else, and here they were like robots, but so exciting. You can't imagine how exciting. Because it paralleled the Bauhaus, the architects, the artists of that period. He absolutely captured everything. It was short-lived, but it was totally pure. That was the great one. The third one was the birth of the French ready-to-wear. All those little houses that I don't know if they exist now, V to V, and well, there's so many of them. It's so hard for me to right off the bat remember their names, but that was exciting. That was and then of course, Saint Laurent was very beautiful and very nice, but that was in the older French tradition. So, it was fine. And here in America, it was the manufacturers. Designers were still in the back room, And Narelle, it was for a product. Narelle made clothes that were sold on a hanger in a rack. They weren't custom made. And everything about the make of them. The hems were this deep, the pockets.
Yeah,
he'd spend weeks, the placement of a pocket and the flap. I mean, they all had a reason why they were important. You don't become influential unless you've really done something. And one of the funniest things in a career, you'd say funny, but one of the things I always look back at Chez Ninon, where, you say we dressed Mrs. Onassis, it was Jackie Kennedy. Well, that was the least. At that time, before she was married to the senator, she would come in and on the sale rack because those people couldn't afford the kind of things we had, And they were lovely people, but the Chez Ninon, we dressed the richest people in the country, the Mellons. There wasn't a Vanderbilt or an Astor we didn't dress. Everyone. Mm-hmm. The Armours from Chicago, the Cabots from Boston, the ones who spent money, the law. It was, you can't imagine what it was like. That was a world that ended in the late 60s. So when people say Mrs. Kennedy or Mrs. Onassis, she was a charming woman. and charming in the sense she had a sense of humor and all of that. And later on, when there was the White House, she had to be so cautious because people distorted it. So it's not fair, but to think that she was the star client at Cheney Noam would be totally wrong. I mean, that's not what it was about at all. And of course, the third partner in Cheney Noam was Ailsa Mellon Bruce, Andrew Mellon's daughter.
Oh.
So you see, and those women all came. Mrs. Park's father was married in the White House. He was Secretary of State, I think, if I remember, and married to President Wilson's daughter. So they came from enormous backgrounds. And Mrs. Shonard's family were preeminent Georgian people from Georgia, Savannah, and I think governors and so forth, and they go way back. But they were women of great taste, and they started in business because they had bad marriages in the 20s, and women in business was unheard of, but their fathers let them go in for fear they might commit suicide from bad marriage, and they started these businesses to dress their friends, because they knew how their friends lived, what they needed. Everyone else was guessing.
Right.
No one knew how these people lived, the DuPonts and the people of the great fortunes at that time. These women knew. They came from that ambience. And that's how the taste was done. That's how we bought things in Paris. John Fairchild, he always said, well, did Jackie buy this? I said, no, those people would never buy that. You wear it once and everyone knows it. They buy something that has a longevity to it. Their investments, their clothes. And that's why some people were disappointed when they saw the Met Museum. They didn't speak spectacular. Well, those people would never buy anything spectacular. They're not spendthrifts. I mean, all right, Barbara Hutton maybe was a spendthrift or something like that, but they didn't do things like that.
Thank you so much for your time. This was so informative for me, and it was just a pleasure.
Well, to speak with you, Marilyn, because you're a woman of enormous taste, enormous imagination. That's great. I mean, I can relate to you.
Oh, okay. Well, I can relate to you.
If you were someone in a business suit, it mightn't be quite the same.
Okay, well...
And we're both enthusiasts in fashion.
I think that's very true. I think that, there was an old saying about what Barney Pressman, who founded Barney's, said years ago. What are you going to do, little Barney, when you grow up? And he said, I don't know, but we're all going to need clothes. And I mean, that's pretty much, as you said earlier, clothing is not brain surgery. It is not going to make the world right. It's not going to change all the problems with the world, but it sure goes a long way to sort of enhance life. So
first thing you do when you get up in the morning, you brush your teeth and get dressed.
Exactly. So thank you so much, Bill.
A pleasure.